initiative, and we're hoping that if any of you are not connected to us yet, that you will get connected during the program tonight. We're going to start right with the presentation by Judith Levine. Judith is a journalist who writes on a wide variety of issues: sexuality, justice, politics, social movements, but she's also a person who is connected and involved in those social movements. She explores in her writings the way history, culture, and politics express themselves in our intimate life. So I want to learn about that. She has written hundreds of articles and 4 books. She has written the book Harmful to Minors: The Perils of Protecting Children from Sex. This book won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. However, it created quite a stir, which if she has time, she might tell us a little bit about. Her latest book, which will be out soon.
Not that soon, unfortunately.
Oh, which won't be out soon, but eventually. Is The Feminist and the Sex Offender: How to End Sexual Violence and Abolish the Sex Offense Punishment Regime. Hence the title for tonight's talk. The book is co-authored with Erica, is it Myers? Judith is a board member of the National Center for Reason and Justice, and we're grateful to the Center for Reason and Justice for making it possible for us to have Judith here today, who drove down from Vermont. So please welcome Judith Levine.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for all the work you're doing, and everyone else here who's working. So, I'm going to begin. I know that this is not necessarily a friendly crowd to feminists, so if you want to throw tomatoes or spitballs or yell or boo right now, you can do it. But I'm going to actually give you a little tour through feminism so that you can, partly I'm here to, with a peace pipe, to tell you guys that we are not all out there gunning for you. So I'll tell you 2 stories that happened in the last couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, I think, in the New York Times Magazine, they have this ethicist. People write in with ethical problems, moral problems that they can't figure out for themselves, and a guy gives them advice. So this man wrote in, and he said that he was in a food court in a mall, and he saw a man about 30 years old with a girl who was about 12, he thought, 12 or 13, and the man had his arm around the girl, and he was touching her hair. And the writer said he worried that this man was a pedophile and he was grooming this girl. And he didn't know what to do. He had 4 possibilities. 1 is he could do nothing. 2, he could confront the man. 3, he could call the police. And 4, he could go and talk to security. So he mulled it over and he went and talked to the mall security, which I'm sure who was a great judge of these things. So that was one story. The other story was, I'm on a listserv of people who, some of them are researchers, sexologists, sex therapists, and among the people who are active on this list is a guy who's, he's a leader in the community of minor attracted adults who do not act on their desires. They're kind of support group for each other. So there was a conversation about, I guess, one of the priests who's been accused of abusing 2 young men, and he just wrote in passing, well, if a woman's sexual history is an important part to bring to trial if there's a question about consent. So I wrote him and I said, actually, a woman's sexual history is not admissible in court, that even women who have a lot of sex, even sluts, get raped. And so so I thought, like, here are these two groups of people who are not talking to each other. There's over here, we understand this problem of the guy in the mall. All of a sudden, everybody's panicked about a man who's sitting next to a girl. In fact, the writer said it could be his daughter. I mean, it sounded like it probably was his daughter. On one side, and so people who are kind of wanting to get sex offenders, and then on the other side, there are people who are in the community of people who might be have sex convictions, who don't understand, I think, anything about rape, about what rape is. Don't take rape, I think, in some ways, in my view, seriously enough. And so I think that it's important for us to talk to each other because, as I'll say, I think we have many issues and many in common, many interests in common. So, feminist and sex offender, how we're gonna do all this stuff, starting tomorrow. This is just a little Venn diagram of different kinds of feminism. So, carceral feminism is from, the word carceral comes from the same root as incarcerate. So carceral people are people who want to use prosecution and punishment to solve, well, pretty much anything. Any social problem, let us punish it. So that's who carceral feminists are. On the left here we have genderqueers, people who are kind of in general radicals about sex, pro-sex and sex workers. Sex workers in many places are criminalized. Bill was just telling me about a decriminalization effort in New York. And so many of these people are feminists. They are trying to just do work and be treated like workers and not be treated like criminals. And so they're also feminists. And then on the other side, on the right, there is a growing group, it's been around for a long time, mostly of women of color, some people who have experienced sexual violence themselves, who are anti-carceral, and I'll talk about why that is true. And so there's a big bunch of different balloons out there. So I'll start with in the early 60s, from the 60s to the 80s, I was around then, as it seems like most of you were. The second wave of American feminism made rape an issue. In 1971, in St. Clement's Church in New York, there was the New York Radical Feminists had a speak out. There were about 300 women there, 40 women testified. It was the first time that women had come out and spoken in public about rape in a big group. And people told some really awful stories, about being raped by a gynecologist, about being raped by their husbands, by their brothers, by their friends, by their coworkers. And women had a lot to be angry about in those days. Police routinely ignored rape, or they ridiculed or they brutalized women who came in as victims. Hospitals put you at the end of the queue. You were not really an emergency. You had to show bruises. You had to show signs of coercion. The prosecution could bring in your sexual history to say you asked for it. Nobody talked about, there was no such thing as marital rape. It was a husband's right to have sex with his wife, whether she wanted to or not. And no surprise, there were actually very few convictions for rape at that time. But the way we looked at it was, rape was not just something that one person did to another person, but rather it was a political thing, a way that men generally, or the patriarchy, kept women in their places. And so we saw this as a political, structural thing. It was not just about a sick person, a guy who has like some sort of pathology, who is a sex offender, sexually violent predator, all this kind of stuff. And so our feeling was at that time that if we were going to change this, if we were going to make it possible for us to live peacefully, we would have to change important things, like about marriage. We'd have to make sure that women had, good jobs so that they could leave an abusive relationship. So we said sexual violence is a matter to be dealt with. It's no longer personal, political. Rape is a political matter. It has to be dealt with politically. There were people who, this is Valerie Solanas. You might have seen the movie I Shot Andy Warhol. That's Lily Taylor in the bottom. She played Valerie Solanas. Valerie Solanas had this group called SCUM, which is a Society to Cut Up Men. She was a crazy person, but also, so she was like the way left end of anti-rape, anti-violence people. Although she was violent herself, she shot Andy Warhol and he almost died. So that was the real radicals. But mainly the anti-rape movement was people, the rape crisis centers where people could go. These were really kind of do-it-yourself, homemade organizations. There were no police involved. There was no money. People were just in houses. You know, you found out about this stuff in the backs of in cubicles in toilets. Have you been raped? You could, there were flyers. Women did their own security. So this was really not looking to the state to solve this problem. This was something that women were going to do to help one another. At other rape crisis centers, they understood that groups like this did, they did other kinds of services, crisis services, jobs and employment, anti-racist kind of stuff. It was direct action, this starting in 1978 with these Take Back the Night marches. And then there were kind of liberal reformists. The National Organization of Women did legislative lobbying. They tried to change the laws. They went around and educated judges and prosecutors and police about the frustrating and traumatizing experiences that women were having within the court system and with the police. There's Betty Friedan on the right, who was
Shirley Chisholm.
early, and Shirley Chisholm, first black woman in Congress. She was elected in 1968. And by the mid-80s, a lot of what we think of now as kind of basic rape law was put in place. And the victim's sexual history is inadmissible. There was criminalization of spousal rape, gender neutral, in most places, gender neutral definitions of sexual assault that include non-penetrative and non-consensual acts perpetrated on any sex by any other sex. Although I'm just reading, the FBI actually defines rape as something that happens to a woman. And if it happens to a man, it's called sexual assault. And then there were also a system of special victims units. We've all watched that. So, but this movement was really not a law and order movement. You can see that in the same New York Radical Women, they're the people who had to speak out. We do not want to make rape laws more punitive. We're not demanding capital punishment. We're not demanding castration. This was a very, very clear anti-state, anti-punishment position. So the idea was that we're going to change the world politically in a way that people would be kinder to one another, that we would be honest about sex, that there would be, no need for men to put women down, and that's the way we were going to change things, not by throwing people in prison. Of course, there were some people who did want to throw people in prison, and those are the people that we call carceral feminists. So this is, as I said before, it's committed to a law and order agenda, and I'll talk about the welfare state to the carceral state. And carceral has to do with jails and prisons, and it has to do with the whole thing, the surveillance of people who have sex offenses, all the stuff that happens after you come out of prison, civil commitment, the whole damn thing. It's a way of thinking about solving social problems by punishing. So this was a period of time, feminists were really not alone in this feeling. We were really moving from a welfare state. A welfare state, I know in the US the word welfare has a kind of bad connotation, but a welfare state is simply a state that spends government money to take care of people, to have health care, to have daycare, to have, benefits for people who don't have jobs. And we were moving from a welfare state more and more to a carceral state. This law and order trend had been going on for quite a long time. In the 1960s, Barry Goldwater brought it up in his presidential campaign. Nixon was the law and order president. Ronald Reagan, when he was a governor of California, and then when he was a president. All of these were carceral, law and order kinds of guys. And by the 1980s, the whole United States was taking there's a criminologist named David Garland, you should read him, he called it a punitive turn. And a sociologist, Jonathan Simon, said that we were governing through crime. So this is the only way that we were going to govern, none of the rest of it. And so the idea was that if there was a social problem, it is the individual's fault. And that's also what we call neoliberalism. If you are poor, it's your fault. If you are disabled, it's your fault. If you can't take care of your kids, it's your fault. And so it's not only your fault, it's for you to take care of. Nobody else is going to help you. And as I said before, whatever the problem is, let's punish it. And the culmination of this was the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill that Bill Clinton signed. It was a bipartisan bill. It was 356 pages long. It required states to establish sex offender registries. It created 60 new death penalty offenses. It eliminated college education for prison inmates. It poured billions and billions of dollars into new prison construction. And at the very same time that Bill Clinton signed that bill, he also pledged to end welfare as we know it. And what that meant was that people did not get money because they needed it. They got money because somebody decided that they deserved it. And so we moved away from helping families, from helping, there's a real correlation between poverty, family disorganization, and child abuse of all kinds, child battery, child neglect. It's not because poor people are immoral, it's because they have a lot of stresses in their lives. And so instead of actually taking care of the whole structure of why children were in danger by helping their families, by making sure there's good schools and good neighborhoods, what the state began to do was to police families in order to protect children. And it was kind of a division between, there are the bad adults here and the good children. And so we see in many poor families, they go and they take the children away from the parents, often really because they're poor. And part of the crime bill was the Violence Against Women Act. And so, as I said, the Violence Against Women Act was part of the Omnibus Crime Bill, and it really married the anti-violence feminists to the violent state. Lee Goldmark, she's a lawyer who defends women who have been the victims of domestic violence. She said the anti-violence movement believed that if we made these problems illegal, they would go away. Along with the crime panic was the sex panic. So we have this violent crime. A guy named DiIulio in the 1990s invented this kind of a person which was called a super predator. A super predator was alleged to be a young black man who was going around raping and pillaging and selling drugs and with no remorse, with completely ruthless, would kill his own mother. This was a completely invented person. And yet, and as you know, Hillary Clinton used the word, and when she ran for president, people called her on that. That word was criticized as being racist, as being dehumanizing, and it was retired. I mean, it really got rid of it. But then, not too long after that, the word predator arises again, but now it's a sexual predator. So you kind of put these two things together, and you have the sexually violent predator. Every bad thing you could be. In 1989, in Washington State, there were two really horrific crimes that happened very close to one another. One was the murder of a young woman by an inmate on work release who had a history of sex offenses, and the other was an assault and mutilation of a little boy, also a sex offender who had just been released. So Washington put together this task force about community protection, and they came up with the the Community Protection Act of 1990. This was the first it was the first sex offender law. It was really the mother of everything that we have now. There was, it's a terrible picture, but the group of victims' rights people, they call themselves the Tennis Shoe Brigade. I can't really remember why. Do you, Bill? Something to do with tennis shoes.
Really?
Friends of Diane. Diane was the woman who was killed. And so it established a sex offender registry, community notification. They invented this term, the sexually violent predator. Some guys in the Washington Assembly decided they were going to come up with this diagnosis in order to put people into civil commitment after their prison sentences. People like these two monsters who had done these horrible things, the worst of the worst, those people would be able to be diagnosed as this thing called a sexually violent predator, which is a person who has a psychological abnormality, which presumably predisposes him to commit another sex crime. And the main symptom of being a sexual violent predator is that you have already committed a crime. So it's this kind of circular thing. You're going to commit another crime because you already committed a crime. And as many people in this room know, the recidivism rate for people with sex offenses is actually extraordinarily low. All of this was ostensibly to protect children. And so, very soon we began to have this pileup of all these children's laws. So the governor of Washington called that the Community Protection Act a tribute to the victims. And I think that's an important thing to think about because it was really a political thing. I mean, he was doing this, and in fact the ACLU decided that they were not going to testify because they thought it was too controversial at that point. There were kind of afterwards when the interviews were done of assembly people and politicians, they all just said, there was no way we could oppose this thing. And so that you see these laws get made in the midst of a panic, and then you can never get rid of them. So we have this series of laws, one on top of another. Each one of them is named for a white middle-class child who is the victim of a spectacularly, extraordinarily rare crime. These are crimes like the child is kidnapped from her home, taken out to the woods, raped, mutilated, and murdered. I mean, this is so rare as to be statistically non-existent. I mean, there's a journalist who said if you left your kid outside and wanted him to be kidnapped by a sex offender or by anybody really, you would have to wait statistically you'd have to wait 750,000 years for your child to be and some people would like to have their child away for 750,000 years.
Worth the wait.
The results of this, we have 900,000 people on the sex offender registry, 6,500 people are in civil commitment. Most of you know about the vilification and stigma. And it helps to build up this prison nation. We have more people in prison in the United States than any place else in the world. It's interesting because the picture of the sex offender in the press and on SVU is always a white guy. And as a matter of fact, sex offenders, white men, are represented in about the same proportion as they are in the population, that is 2/3. But still, men of color are disproportionately represented on the sex offender registry and in community notification. So the idea that this person is really dangerous to be letting out, you should better tell the neighbors about him. If that man is black or brown, it is more likely that the police are going to want to tell the neighbors that he's coming back. And you remember in 1974 they said we don't want to castrate, we don't want to capital punishment, and yet now this is in India, but it happens here too, hang these rapists. And that was in Mumbai. It was in 2011 after a really horrible gang rape of a photojournalist. So now comes the sex offender. I'm going to call this people sex offenders, even though I don't really like like that term. Yeah,
Sorry, I need to interrupt you, but you're gonna talk about the Me Too movement in Carson?
I am.
Okay, thank you, sir. I
Didn't
thought
happen
you
yet.
went by the feminists, okay.
we're,
great.
we're only in 1990.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you were done with the. Okay.
So beginning in the late 90s, people who were on the registry and people who worried about this kind of panic began to organize. Bob, when did NCRJ start?
2002.
2002. That's Bob and Jim and I. So began to be this movement of registered citizens, I guess is the word to use now. So this is, again, like the kinds of people who are involved, and they're overlapping, and there's registered citizens and their families, groups like Women Against Registry, sex workers who are criminalized for doing sex work, and other people who are criminalized for having sex in public, in parks. This still happens even after Stonewall. People are still entrapped. You know, every once in a while some right-wing, politician gets entrapped in a bathroom, and you find out that, hey, they're entrapping queer men in bathrooms. Somehow they always get these Christian, right-wing Christians, I don't know why. Then there are people, progressive social justice activists, who don't have any, they meet people on the registry by doing the work, but they don't have anybody in their family, like me. I don't have anyone in my family who's on the registry, although it could happen. And as you know, especially this movement is very strong in the South. I think it's the strongest in the South, really, and so there's a lot of fundamentalist Christians in this movement, a lot of white fundamentalist Christians. They're the people who are doing the halfway houses in the South. It's the people who have the meetings, and there's many people who are in those groups in the South who are Christians. And Christians, why? I'll talk about it afterwards, but I think it is it's a really interesting thing. Part of it is because super religious people have a high rate of child abuse. So that's part of it. And then in 1999, I'm going to give a little shout out here to Paul. Boston was involved in its own sex panic, and they started to talk about having a registry here. And so Paul just gave me this call to safeguard our children and our liberties, which was a petition that went around against establishing a sex offender registry in the state of Massachusetts. And it's a really interesting document. They kind of reproduced it again in 2007 because it talks about the facts about that most children who are abused within their own families and not by strangers. It was early on, it was before there really was very much research about this stuff that we knew. And of course we didn't have the registry around for 20 years yet, so there was not any kind of data. But it also was a statement about social justice, that we shouldn't be singling out one group of people to make pariahs of. And when you look at the list of signers, it's really a broad range of people. People like Ruth Hubbard, who was an anti-eugenicist, a biologist, a peace activist. Kathy Hoffman, another peace activist. Bob and people like that. Nancy Ryan, a feminist. Roz Baxendall, who was now dead, a women's historian. Howard Zinn. And so this was seen as an issue of social justice. This was not like some little boutique issue now, that like now everybody in this room, probably 90% of the people in this room are people who are on the registry. And so it went from being understood as a social justice issue and a criminal justice issue to being this, because of the registry, I think, and because of the laws that we have, to pushing to marginalizing this issue, not only marginalizing the people, but marginalizing the politics. It was just, I just saw this thing, and it was just very, very striking to see who signed this thing. And I don't know, when Paul, in 2007, did the same people come forward and Paul Shannon?
Not all of them.
Yeah.
The other group, Criminal Justice Policy Coalition and ROS, were active at those early years too, in terms of organizing that hearing.
So,
But it was still broader in 2007 in terms of
so here actually,
hundreds and hundreds of people that were not on the registry signed it. We didn't allow people that were on the registry to sign it because it was too dangerous.
and you said there were several hundred people who signed. This is
Over
from,
1,000.
this is the one, Paul wrote a kind of a manifesto in Counterpunch, and also it was turned into a petition. These are just a few of the things that, again, these are political principles. Demonizing any class of people as devoid of humanity and beyond redemption is wrong. So these are moral principles, ethical principles that underlie, that are not just about this kind of sort of technical stuff we talk about, what percentage of recidivism and all of this other kind of stuff. That this is really wrong to do to any human being, to see some class of people as unredeemable. And then that year, 2007, was the first RSOL, Reform Sex Offender Laws, national gathering, and this is the one from the following year. And, now we have all over the country, at any given time, 24 or maybe 30 little groups of people in different states that do all kinds of different things. I mean, some of the groups are really sort of ministries, some of them are really support groups, some of them are doing much more kind of political stuff. In California, the head of the Alliance for Constitutional Sex Offense Laws is Janice Bellucci, who is a lawyer, and she's gone around and sued small towns for their residency laws, and the same thing happened in Texas. They told these little towns that they were going to sue them if they put these residency laws in place, and it worked. I mean, people got scared. I mean, these little towns don't have enough money to defend themselves, and some towns just said, okay, we're not going to do it. And Janice did a thing about Halloween. So a bunch of towns are going to put up signs on Halloween on people's lawns. This person is a sex offender. And WAR, Women Against Registries, shows up. Whenever they have their sign, people are kind of amazed. And then now there's the National NARSOL, National Association for the Reform of Sex Offense Laws. These groups are, some of them are more reformist and some of them are more radical. WAR actually, I think, is the only group that says that it is in favor of abolishing the sex offense registry. I think it's the only one of these groups that actually comes out and says that. Texas. Oh, yeah. WAR, Women Against Registry, which is mostly out of Missouri, but there are people all over the country, and Texas now too.
Very, very talented.
Texas was one of the first groups. She really holds that thing together with, she's a very small woman, and she does a lot. But, people, when you talk to people who are running these groups privately, they'll all say, oh, we're all against the registry, we all want to get rid of civil commitment, but then NARSOL, for instance, comes out and says people should only be, residency restrictions should apply only while you're on parole or on probation. And, so okay, you should be homeless for a few months or a year or two, but then not after that. So, but people say to me, like one woman said to me, if we said that we were against the registry, want to abolish the registry, we would be laughed off the map. That's what she said. So I've been talking about feminists, and I'm talking about the registered citizens. They are at odds. I always thought I would never be somebody who would do this kind of thing on a PowerPoint with arrows and shit. But it's so seductive, it's really hard not to do. So, isn't that great? So on this side, and what this thing reproduces is also the adversarial relationship that is in our court systems. You are for the perpetrator or you are for the victim. You cannot be for both. And the job of the defense attorney is to say that the guy didn't do it, even if he did do it, and if he did it, he didn't do it that much, and it wasn't really his fault. And then the job of the victim is, you know, the prosecutor is to say, he did it, and he did it so bad, and we're gonna charge him with 950 charges, and maybe we'll get one convicted. So, this is you know, we find ourselves in, I think, an adversarial relationship that is not necessary and is extremely destructive. Meanwhile, however, during all this time, there was another group of feminists who were not buying either one of these they were not among the white feminists who, basically what we believe, I was a white feminist in those days and still am, that sex, gender, was such a huge defining thing of, you know, people's lives, people's social position, people's economic position, and rape was so universal and such a, you know, that every woman, even women who have never been sexually assaulted, walk around knowing that it could happen to them, that this was such a powerful, unifying theme, sex and sexual violence, that it would bring everybody in. But women of color, even back then, were saying, you know, no, that's not really true. I'm not just a woman. I'm African American, I'm Jamaican, I live in a poor neighborhood, my grandfather was a slave. I mean, you know, I have we have crappy schools in my neighborhood. There's other things that I care about, and I cannot just say I'm a woman. I'm not gonna say I'm black. You know, people have complicated identities. So right away, National Black Women's Feminist Organization, Essie Green Williams was an organizer with the National Black Feminist Organization, and this is what she said about rape. She said, trying to deal with the rape issue when there are so many other issues of survival in the black community, it becomes a matter of priorities. And so the Third World Women's Alliance, they identified the problems as racism, imperialism, and sexism. Those were the three big issues that they thought of. And it's interesting that imperialism was one of those because at that time in the 70s, foreign policy, the U.S.'s role in the world was right up there with racism and sexism as a big, as something to be opposed and resisted. And because of this feeling of having a lot of different things necessary to deal with, black women organized, black feminists organized around a lot of issues. Daycare, jobs, International Women's Day, abortion rights. It wasn't just one thing. And the other thing that some people were lesbians. We used to call them lesbians dykes against racism. I mean, this was you can see this is a march of people of color, women of color, and men too. And so you see these are two issues that come together. This is called intersectionality. It means that you have a lot of different parts of your identity, and it was called that by gender theorist called Kimberly Crenshaw. She named it in 1989 or something. This is a group of women who wrote a kind of important statement. This is a group of black lesbians who wrote that they didn't, the sexual sources of women's oppression negate the facts of class and race. And so that you couldn't just deal with this one thing. And they also said that they were not going to buy into something wrong with men because of their biology, like that men are built to rape. Because essentialism, this idea that people are biologically something or some other thing, has been used to justify eugenics and genocide and slavery and everything else. And they were critical of men, but not against men. We struggle together with black men against racism, while we also struggle with black men about sexism. Not your DA's feminists. And so this group, these groups have flourished. They've sort of gone through different incarnations, and now in the last 10 years, 20 years really, there are new groups. Critical Resistance is one of them. They have really great posters. And the issue that has arisen since around the turn of this century, another group called Insight, is the issue of the criminal legal system, and that women who are organizing in groups like Insight recognize that we have to deal with interpersonal violence, and we also have to deal with state violence at the same time. That using the state as the violent institutions of the state in order to address interpersonal violence is just going to perpetuate more and more violence. And these are women who recognize that their communities are being torn apart, are being decimated by mass incarceration, and Black women have never really been able to go to the police anyway, because they were never considered legitimate victims. And so when Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, was founded in 2001, Andrea Ritchie speaks for a feminist political strategy that embraces the possibility of prison abolition, where we would bring together attention to state violence as an essential aspect of ending violence against women of color and non-gender conforming communities. All people would be safer. When VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, came up for reauthorization in 2008, those people weren't interested, and a lot of people who fought for it in the beginning had second thoughts, because it turned out to be, it actually hasn't reduced violence against women, and it has really harmed. For instance, there was a mandatory arrest in domestic violence. Somebody calls, the police arrive, they have to arrest somebody. Sometimes they'll arrest the man, sometimes they'll arrest both people. Whoever happens to have his or her hand up at the moment, they will arrest. Now, this is really destructive in a family. I mean, you lose your job, you go to jail, now you're in the court system, you have a record, you lose your kids. I mean, you can lose a lot when this happens. And so this was really not helping. And guess who was getting mostly sent to jail was also poor women, single mothers, relationships that the police didn't think were the proper relationships. And so, even though VAWA has been reauthorized, there are many feminists, including myself, who think that it was a bad idea. Okay, we move on to Larry Nassar. January 2018, you all remember this case. At the sentencing hearing of Larry Nassar, the judge, Rosemary Aquilino, did two extraordinary things. One was that she let 156 victims speak. And Larry Nassar, if you don't remember, was the USA Gymnastics doctor who was doing this thing that he called massage or something. Basically, he's putting his fingers into the girls' vaginas and traumatically moving his hand around. And they were little girls. I mean, they were no gymnast is over 12 years old, because you can't have a woman's body and be a gymnast. 156 women spoke, discussed fear, humiliation, and long-term effects, depression, anxiety, mental illness. And meanwhile, while they spoke, the judge praised their courage and their strength. And then she turned to Larry Nassar, and she said, if the US Constitution did not forbid cruel and unusual punishment, I might allow what he did to all these beautiful souls, these young women in their childhood. I would allow someone or many people to do to him what he did to others. And she imposed a 175-year sentence, and she also said, as she did that, she was signing his death warrant. And so the question was really was she telling other inmates to murder Larry Nassar in prison? That seemed to be a fair inference from what she said. Or at the very least rape him. So this, I think, went over the line in what presumably fair adjudicator of law should be doing. But the room burst into applause when she said that. And she instantly became a star of the Me Too movement, which was happening just at that moment. This is the Golden Globes. There were tweets, called her badass, class act. The media was adulating her. And there were only a few critics who said she really went too far. So this is Me Too, and you have these fancy, famous white actresses, and Ajin Poo, so Meryl Streep, Ajin Poo is the head of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Natalie Portman, Tarana Burke, who founded Me Too a long time ago, Michelle Williams, America Ferrara, Jessica Chastain, Amy Poehler, and the restaurant workers organizer at the end, Sarah Jaraman. So, we can talk more about Me Too if you want to. The main thing I want to say about it is that it has definite carceral tendencies. The movement has really adopted naming and shaming as its kind of main tactic. Reveling in the curb walks, and of course people have also called for harsher punishment, feeling that people are not, we should more criminalize things that are now civil offenses. I think, many people feel that the Me Too movement is excessive. I actually think we know that the problem of sexual harassment is real and it is pervasive. And it's not just harassment. I mean, women really get raped at work, they get, and many people, such as the women who these organizers represent, often cannot come forward. They may be undocumented, they can't afford to lose their jobs. And so there are many people who are silent about it. But one of the things that always strikes me about this stuff is that everybody was using the word predator about these guys. Everyone was a predator, Louis C.K. was a predator. Some of these guys, you might call Harvey Weinstein a predator. I think if there's one word that we can get rid of that would make a huge political difference, it would be the word predator. And from now on, never use it. Still at odds. And so, I think that when people, for instance, when Brock Turner, this student, was given a 6-month sentence for having sexually assaulted a woman who had passed out, not only did they get the judge recalled, but people were saying he should have been in prison for a much longer time, and he's only on the registry. He's only on the registry. So I think most people don't really know what it is to be on the registry and think of it as just a slap on the wrist and not a lifelong sentence. And at the same time, I really do think that when we talk about, for instance, Me Too, I hear from many people who are on the registry that it's not so bad, and it's really, so I think there's, it's not so, harassment's not so bad, and maybe there isn't so much rape, and people are crying rape. And so there's a kind of another one of these loggerheads here where both sides are minimizing the pain of each other, I would say. But there were people, such as these women of color, Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba, so this was a real challenging moment. People are committed to justice for survivors of sexual assault and also believe that prisons are the wrong answer to violence and should be abolished. We decry the system and advocate for change that is long overdue. When we see defendants as symbols of what we most fear and that which we most greatly despise, we are confronted with the true test of our belief that no justice can be done under this system. It said, like all tests of faith, this moment calls on us to recommit ourselves to true transformative justice. Okay, what is transformative justice? Transformative justice, It's not the be-all, end-all, but it sure is a step in the right direction. Transformative justice, instead of retribution, it looks for repair. You get to actually talk to a person who has harmed you, and the person who has done harm gets to hear from the person who gets harmed. The focus is not on punishing, it is on repairing the harm in whatever way it's gonna work. And also maybe with the community. The community is represented, not just the state. You know, in the people, they always call the prosecutors the people. But actual, real people from the community, I do it. This is, restorative justice is a process, it's a set of practices that happen sometimes within the criminal justice system, sometimes just within communities, and characterized by dialogue and negotiation instead of adversarial. And it asks different questions. Instead of what law was broken, is what was the harm? Who broke the law? How can the harm be repaired? How should they be punished? Who's responsible for this repair? And the community is involved in this, and it can take a long time. And transformative justice is basically these restorative justice practices plus politics. I mean, basically what they say is there are systems within which violence happens, that condone violence, that perpetuate violence. These systems like institutional racism, poverty, all of these things that let violence happen. And if we're not gonna change those, we will never get rid of violence. And that is the reason to abolish prisons, for instance, because we all know people do not get better in prison. It's a brutalizing institution. And it doesn't, and especially now that we don't have anything in prison, that, you know, there's no work or anything to do. So how are we gonna get together here? Again, the first thing I think is that where we come together here is abolition. I really feel that the sex offender movement must be abolitionist about the entire regime, about the sex offender registry, about civil commitment. There are reforms. There's a geographer and activist called, an anti-prison activist named Ruthie Gilmore, and she talks about non-reformist reforms. And those are the reforms that move toward a radical goal. So, for instance, the anti-abortion movement wants to get rid of abortion altogether, so they've been picking, they take, you know, they do this, they make it hard in this way and that way and this other way, but they know that their goal is to abolish abortion. If we know that our goal is to abolish the sex offender registry, we should never do anything that legitimizes the registry, that makes the registry stronger, that has, I know Paul wanted to do a law enforcement only registry. I think it's a very bad idea, because then we have another goddamn registry we have to deal with. And also it legitimizes it. We really need it for some people, just the worst of the worst, not me, but that other guy. And so we need to be thinking all the time, if we want to get rid of this thing, what things can we do that move in that direction and don't move us in the other direction? This is true of all organizing. Each time you think about, am I moving in the right direction? I'm gonna have to undo something that I did. Let's not do that one. So this is where registered citizens come together with abolitionists, with, Christians. One of the things that secular people in the restorative justice movement and Christians have, and other religious people have in common, is the belief in redemption. The belief that you're not the worst thing you ever did, that everybody can, come back, and we don't have a lot of that. We don't have very much secular language for redemption. I think RJ is a secular language for redemption, and there's less and less of that around. And so I think the meeting point here is abolition. The other thing is this is Angela Davis, who was, if you don't know who she was a great black activist in the Black Power movement and has been a prison abolitionist. She's a theorist, philosopher. People on the front lines against violence against women should also be on the front lines of prison abolition. struggles, and those opposed to police crime should be opposed to domestic privatized violence. So she calls this abolition feminism. And so if we look at all these Venns together, where do we go together? The abolition feminists, and I'm going to talk about pro-sex in a minute. Prison abolitionist feminism, these are where I think we can come together, transformative justice and abolition, prison and the sex offender legal regime. So the last thing I want to say is, talking about violence and punishment and all this other horrible stuff, why do we want to do this? Why should we want to? Aside from it being unjust, aside from it ruining people's lives, all of that stuff, what is sex for? It's supposed to be for joy, it's supposed to be for fun, it's supposed to be for pleasure, it's supposed to be for connection. And so all through this period there have been, during the rise of carceral feminism, there were always people like me who were saying, like, let's not criminalize everything, let's not ban pornography, and the idea of having safety in the world so that we actually could have sex, the kind of sex we want. I didn't say this in the beginning, but rape, the word rape, as far as I'm concerned, is non-consensual sex. If it is consensual, it is not rape. So statutory rape, we should get rid of altogether. It is not rape. Rape is doing something to somebody that they do not want. And so there are movements. This is the Red Umbrella movement, which is a kind of global coalition of sex workers. Sex workers are often the victims of police violence. And so basically what sex offender movement, rights movement says is work is work. There's no work that is by definition degrading. There's a lot of work that is degrading, but not because of what it is. You can be washing dishes and be dignified. You can be doing sex and be dignified. It has to do with, are you paid fairly? Are your working conditions good? Can you organize collectively? Are you not being criminalized? Are you not being dragged off by the police for doing your job? And so this Red Umbrella movement has it's really grown all over the world. And as I said, Bill was just saying that in New York there's a new campaign to decriminalize. And then there's also the sex issue of heresies was a group of what we called pro-sex feminists in 1981. It came out. It was looking at pornography as a kind of really broad genre of all kinds of stuff. It came out sort of in opposition to people who wanted to ban pornography. And pleasure activism is a new book that I think came out like 2 or 3 days ago. Adrienne Marie Brown is a black, very young organizer. She wrote a good book called Emergent Strategies, and she calls herself a pleasure activist. And she herself was actually a survivor of a lot of abuse as a child, and she said she didn't want to be that for the rest of her life. She wanted to be defined by that. So there continues to be pleasure activism, and I really feel that if we had a world in which a great variety of sex and desire was accepted and tolerated, we wouldn't have these horrible laws that we have. So that's it, that's enough already.
Talk about trash.
But
You're in Boston, so we thought you would talk about your restaurant crap. I'm all you.
yeah,
If you've heard the press on that, but
yeah.
anyway, I don't interrupt you.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have all the facts.
Okay, I was just.
We're gonna have, we
Okay.
still have 20 minutes for
Yeah,
questions.
some people can talk.
But first, a word from our sponsor. Just to let you know, a few things going on. It'll be interesting to see how they fit into this perspective. Will Brownsberger Senator Will Brownsberger has filed a bill that would leave it to judicial discretion about whether someone has to wear a bracelet, a GPS bracelet, for their entire probation period. Right now, anyone convicted as of 2006, once they get out of jail and are on probation, or if they're sentenced to just probation, 10, 15, 20 years, however long they sentence them now, they have to wear a GPS system that entire period. Judges have no right to stop it. This would allow judges to decide whether particular people, once they're on probation or parole, whether they have to wear the GPS or not. Or maybe after a couple of years, they could appeal and have to go before a judge again and get that damn bracelet off. Okay, so this is a tiny little bill, but it would make a big difference for a lot of people wearing these GPS systems. So this is it's a Senate docket bill 1426. It'll be assigned to a committee. There's only 4 co-sponsors. None of these bills are very very popular, as you know, but there's still time for you to call your reps and senators and ask them to sign on to this bill. Senate docket bill 1426 by Will Brownsberger, who's really trying to do what he can to make the system a little bit more rational. In addition to that, Kay Khan has filed a bill to insist that the Sex Offender Registry Board do studies and provide data. What are the different levels of classification? How many people are there? What is the rate of recidivism? We have 3 levels of classification in Massachusetts. What is the rate of recidivism? The state refuses to do any studies on recidivism. KCON is filing a bill to say, at least put together the information you have for us so we can see what's going on. So this is another important bill. Again, these are bills that don't have a lot of support, even among supporters of criminal justice reform, which is a real problem we have in Massachusetts, where sex offenses are excluded from all of these reforms.
Not just Massachusetts.
Always excluded. And this is a problem with this restorative justice movement. They are not, at least right now,
That's
focused
not the restorative justice movement.
on sex offenders.